Okay, let's see what this is about here. Again, it is possible to make the fonts bigger, but that requires some things that we haven't really talked about here. A whole bunch of other stuff. Okay, so there are three new things here, or at least new for us. But these are things that if you've been using a computer for more than about 10 minutes, you've encountered most of these. At the top is a drop-down list, or what is sometimes called a combo box. I'm not sure why it's called a combo box, but it's basically sort of when you click on the little down arrow thing, we get to select something, and when we select it, what I have here is at the very bottom, what you select is going to be updated here based on this little widget here. So this is it's called a J combo box. In the middle are checkboxes. So the Java class is a J checkbox, and these have all been put into a panel with a grid layout with 2 columns. And the idea is that we have 3 that are selected, and if we select one, again, just the way that I've written this, in responding to the action event, which is fired when you click on this, it updates the middle label at the bottom. So, and what it updates is it'll say which one I clicked and whether it was selected or not. So, how does it get that information? That's all in the action event and how we organize, how this is organized. And then at the bottom, we have a group here which is called radio buttons. Are you familiar with that term, radio button? Some yes, some no. They're called radio buttons. Now, those of you, do you know why they're called radio buttons?
Because it's like the old radio button. The old radio that you need to turn.
Yeah, it's in the old days, actually, car radios in old cars had the way you could have preset stations, the way you do now, but in those preset stations, it was they had these physical buttons that you sort of pulled out and pushed in to set, and when you pressed one, it changed, and the other ones all turned off, and they would physically be pushed in and out. So that's why these are called radio buttons, because unlike the check boxes, when I check one, I can have any combination of checked and unchecked that I want, and none of these affect the other. All of the check boxes are completely independent. But the radio buttons of this group, say this whole collection here, even though they're in 2 columns, it's all in one group, and everything in the group, I can only select one. As soon as I select one, the others are turned off. And in a way, logically, it's similar to this drop-down thing, because with the drop-down, there's only one that's selected. So I have a number of different ones that I can select, but I can only select one at a time in this particular case. Similarly, with the radio buttons, I can only select one at a time. So in terms of functionality, the combo box and the radio buttons have essentially the same functionality in that I have a list of possibilities, but I can choose only one. Now, what's the difference? Why would you use one over the other? Well, in the combo box, I don't really need to see what the other options are until I actually want to. Whereas with the radio buttons, I can see what all the options are. It's probably largely a matter of taste, but the important thing here is not necessarily the specifics of using these particular things, but the way in which it's being done here. I mean, what I find a little disappointing in many of the tutorials is that they can show you how, there are lots of different ways of having this functionality, but there are some ways that are conducive to building larger applications, and there are those that kind of lock you into a way of doing things that is not so great. So, and again, I just in the interest of minimalism, I don't have extra menu. I don't have a menu. I don't have extra stuff to close and things. But I do have that. Remember that window closer class. One of the nice things is basically with just with a few lines, with a declare. I mean, I could do it in fewer lines, but by adding an instance variable that's the window closer and then just adding it as a window listener to this, I automatically get the same functionality that I had before. And that is part of this, the idea of kind of, well, what I like to call the programmer virtue of laziness, because having done this, I don't have to do it again. I just have to instantiate one. All right, so let's take a look at how this was being done. The class is called, it's in the Swing package, the CS2173 Swing package, and it's called Swing Widgets. For some reason, they call these things widgets. I'm not entirely sure why. Does anybody know why? Okay, so we don't know why, but these little things, regardless of what language, they're called widget. These little things that you manipulate. Okay, let's talk about the combo box first. So the J combo box, notice that it has a, before I talk about that, let's notice that it has this thing called body parts. What is body parts? That is an enum that I've defined, and the values are head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Eyes, ears, mouth, and a nose. Head, shoulders. If you have kids, you know what I'm... If you don't have kids, then when you have kids, you may know about it. Anyway, just it's a kid's song. But the thing is that those choices were all enums. And I was able to, oops, where is it? Okay, so the body parts enum, when I defined my combo box, I said, okay, I'm gonna put these enums in here. And again, that's a very useful way of doing things, because the enum, in this case, there is a specific finite list of possibilities, and I want to have only those possibilities, and I want to offer all those possibilities to the user, but I don't want any more. So by making the combo box this way, I'm guaranteeing that only the selections that I've previously decided will be available. Now there's a way of doing this where the user can kind of actually create their own and enter them in, and they get added. Again, that would take us a little, well, if we had more time, we would get into that, but we won't. So let's see how we're organizing this. Okay, again, here's our window closer. Actually, I was lazy. In this case, I knew I was not going to have a menu or anything else, so I didn't need. Notice that the scope of this instance of window closer is just within the call to the add window listener. So I can't get access to that particular instance anywhere else. So that if I wanted to, then this would kind of lock me into that. I would have to refactor it. I'd probably take it out, make it an instance variable if I wanted to reuse it. but in this case I didn't. All right, so I'm going to put all of the widgets in this widget panel, and I'm going to make it a grid layout with one column. Now you notice that the first argument in grid layout, which we talked about previously, are the number of rows. And what the thing about it is the number of rows really has very little to do with how many rows are actually in there. So if you give it 0 rows, it'll be however many you put in. So it's not that I'm going to be now if I put 0 columns in, then I'm not going to be able to put anything in. But so the columns are something that I need to specify. The rows are something that I would typically not specify because that leaves it open. Okay, so I'm going to add that to the center. And again, this is just a little bit of each of these panels, and actually pretty much all the components, have the idea of being able to set a border, and with the border is just something that gets drawn around it. There are lots of different types of borders. In this case, a line border, and I can give it a color, in this case dark gray. And that, what did that do? Oops. If you look carefully, there's a dark gray line around the entire box here. That's what this line does. Okay, now what I wanted the bottom part to be able to give feedback as far as what was selected. So if I selected something else, then that, for the combo box, that was down here in the lower left. So for that, I created a panel now with 3 columns, and so I will have 3 labels in there. So the first label is the one that is selected, and so the combo box has a method called getSelectedItem. Now they've sort of they kind of only went halfway when they made this generic. So even though I declared the combo box to only contain this enum that I defined, they have not had that reflected in their method. Where is it here? Yeah, getSelectedItem unfortunately returns an object rather than, it should return whatever I've defined what the generic is. They didn't do that, and so because the JLabel requires a string, I need, I basically two-string it, and that's what gives this label right here on the bottom. And the fact that it's responding to the different selections means that there must be some action listener or some type of listener going on somewhere. So let's, yeah, it's, let's see, where is it? Yeah, it was up here, yeah. So here's where I instantiate my combo box. Now, they, when Swing talks about this sort of model view controller idea, the idea is that each of their components has behind the scenes a certain model. And for the combo box model, it turns out there are lots of different ones. They provide something called the default combo box model. I've found that to always be everything that I need. And so what I'm doing here is, notice that for the enum, I'm getting the values, so that's going to be an array of all the different enums. And if I put that in there like that, that populates the combo box with all of the different values in the enum. So that's kind of an automatic thing there. Now my action listener, the combo box action listener, which I named, let's take a look at that. All it does is, when it hears the action performed event, which is assumed to be from the combo box, then I set the text of the combo box from the selected item. And again, because this returns an object, and the JLabel I can't put an object into a JLabel, or I can't put it as a set text. Set text requires a string. So if you give me an object and I want to put in that object into the label, I do a toString. Again, I can't cast it to a string because an enum is not a string. Okay, so that's what enables this. And you know, there are other events that a combo box fires, like there's an item listener event, for example. And every time you do something with a mouse, as we've seen, there are mouse events that get fired. When responding to widgets and things in the user interface, I always prefer to use the action listener rather than the more specific ones. And part of the reason for that is that because every component that a user can manipulate does fire an action event, then my action event can be written in a way which is a little more agnostic as far as what exactly is triggering it. We saw that a little bit in some of the previous examples where an exit button or an exit menu item, for example, would trigger exactly the same response. Or the open. Remember when we said open, if it was a button, it would open up a file chooser. If it was a menu item, it would also open up a file chooser. And if we had more time, we'd talk about toolbars and other, I mean, there's lots more. You could probably spend the whole quarter just on the different things on the swing. But that's a little afield from what the objectives are here. The objectives here are that mainly to have a well-designed application, ideally in an object-oriented framework, and then if you want to visualize that, then there are various tools for having a better way to interact with the user on that. So that's all we're after here. Similarly, with the checkboxes, we have to do these kind of one at a time. So here, a J checkbox. Here I'm creating one, and the constructor is heavily overloaded. If I can just give it an empty constructor, I can actually specify, icon. We haven't talked about icons, but here the one where we can just give it the text. But here we can decide whether we want it to be selected or not. That's what causes, when we start it up, notice that these three are selected and this one is not selected. Okay, how did that happen? Well, when we instantiated the first three, we said true, which meant that it would be selected, but when we instantiated the fourth, we said false, which meant that it wouldn't be selected. So basically, a checkbox is a visual representation of a Boolean. It's either checked or it's not checked. So true or false. So when you're displaying what's essentially a Boolean, then a checkbox is a way to do that. If you have a number of independent selections. So here, I can independently choose any one of these and it will not affect the other. So if that's the situation and we're representing in this case, a Boolean, then that's kind of the way to do it. So so we created it, we added it to a panel. So again, I created a panel with two columns. I call it the checkbox panel, 2 columns, and I just kept adding them, and as I added them, they get laid out here, 1, 2, red, and blue. So that's when you have a grid layout and you keep adding things, they go column, and then when you hit the end of the column, you go to the next row. Now, because these are all independent, I had to add each one of them to the instance of the checkbox listener, which I hopefully instantiated somewhere. The checkbox action listener is up here. I instantiated one. I have one instance of that, and then so let's see what that's about. That's a little more complicated because now this one instance is listening to all of the different ones, all the different checkboxes. And so I need to figure out which one it was. And here's how I can do that. The action event that I hear has an instance variable called source and a getter for that called getSource. Again, all the stuff that we talked about earlier about instance variables, setters, and getters, all of that is I mean, unless they're doing something really weird, then in just seeing this, you kind of know something about what's going on with this action event. We know it has an instance variable called source. In this case, the source is whichever component fired that action event. Okay, so now the thing is that is an object, as it turns out. It would have been nicer if it was something like a component, but even if it were a component, in this particular case, what we want to do, what we want the label to reflect is which of these was clicked and whether it was selected or not. That's what we want to display. So to do that, we get the source, and we want to cast it. We need to cast it to a J checkbox, but we can only do that if it's an instance of checkbox, and this is how we check that. We say if the source is an instance of checkbox, then we can safely cast it to a checkbox. And then once it's a checkbox, we can determine whether it's been selected and the text of that. So that this will give us the text of the checkbox that was selected, and this will tell us whether it was selected or not. And this is how we can print the label. Now in this case, I'm using the string format thing, and so here I have a string for which label, and then a string. Now I could have a Boolean, but instead I want to say, well, if you're selected, then I want to say selected. If you're not selected, I'm going to say not selected. So I'm turning the Boolean selected into a string selected or not selected, depending on whether it's true or false. And that's what causes this. So here I clicked on the one fish, and it's not selected. And I click on it again, and now it's selected. Okay, so that's what causes, that is this line right here, which turns the checkbox, basically gets the information from the checkbox about who was selected, what was the label, and whether it was selected or not, and then turns that into what the J label is here. And finally, now for the radio buttons. Now this can be a little confusing. So now the behavior that we want for the radio buttons, and it will happen only if we do a certain thing. The behavior we want is that when we click on one, then that's the only one that gets selected. And then we want to have that reflected here. And in this case, I want to populate it with the same enum that I had previously. So how do we do that? Well, first we define what's called a button group, and that button group is what says which of these are going to be controlled by only one selected. In other words, I could have two button groups, and then there would say one of these would be selected and then one of these would be selected. But that's not what we have here. What we have is that only one of this entire group is selected. That is dictated by which radio buttons are in a button group. So I instantiate the button group, and I instantiate my action listener, because they're all going to have to have the action listener going to listen to each one of them. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate over all of the different enums. I'm going to create a radio button And then again, I need to toString the part as its label. I add the action listener. Then I add that radio button to the button group, and that's the logic that says that only one of these in the button group is going to be selected. But then I need to add it to the panel, so that's what can be a little confusing. The button group is entirely non-visual, it's abstract, and that just says which group of buttons are going to have only one at a time. But the panel is what actually displays them. And in this case, I decided, because I wanted to display one, I said, well, if the part I've selected is the shoulders one, then I'm gonna do this. And this is another useful thing that all of the different button types and have, and that is a method called do-click. And what do-click does is it programmatically clicks that thing. Because the class hierarchy, at the very top of all the different button types is something called an abstract button, which, as its name befits, is an abstract class, which is the superclass of all of the different. It's the superclass of the J button, it's the superclass of the J menu item, it's the superclass of all of these different, of the radio buttons and of the checkboxes. And what that means is that you can programmatically click them. What's nice about that is that if you're looking at how these things respond, as you're developing something, even before you've completely made them visual, when you programmatically click something, you can see how it is responding. In other words, if I'm in a small example like this, it's not such a big deal. In a bigger program, it's useful to be able to programmatically manipulate the different items without having to necessarily lay everything out and put everything in its place. So basically that's what I did here. And so by doing the do click, it's as if the user had clicked it, and what that did was it did everything a click does. Namely, it fired the action event, which caused the radio button listener to do its thing. And again, it was a similar thing as we did with the checkboxes, which is that if the source is a radio button, then I get the selected one and set the text to the one that I'd selected. And that's what causes this label here to respond to whatever one that I'd clicked. Okay, so that's